Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. Season 4, Episode 14. Your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion, where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. Some weeks I am desperate for content. I actually spend a lot of time contemplating, meditating, if you will, on what I'm going to talk about, and then coming up with enough content to fill an entire segment. Not this week. So many things to talk about that I actually made a list, and I didn't get to everything on that list. We'll start with one Sean Combs, the exercise of power, and what amounts to nothing more than prison sex. While we're talking about power, how about Oprah Winfrey? And the fact that as a Weight Watchers promoter, she takes a pill, like the rest of us, to keep her figure fit and trim. A former broadcaster on ESPN, Sage Steele, is making the rounds, promoting a new podcast, a new endeavor because she left ESPN, revealing that an interview that she did with President Biden was completely scripted. Spoiler alert, most presidential administrations want to script everything and everyone that the president interacts with. Is the issue whether or not a presidential candidate or the president himself demanding that you read from a script and that you not deviate from it? Or is the issue whether or not the organization that you work for, is the issue whether or not you, as a supposed, a purported, and alleged journalist, going to agree to that? And Tennessee lost to Purdue in the NCAA Tournament. No, they weren't cheated. Yes, they have some holes to fill, and we will discuss. Thank you all for listening. If you're new to the channel, please like, subscribe, thumbs up, 5-star, write a review, send to friends and enemies far and wide. If you like what you hear and you want to support, This Is Why I Don't Vote podcast is on Patreon. Off we go.
Act 1. Sean Combs and the Exercise of Power.
This saga with Sean Combs is just another episode in a very long book, the chapters of which I've gone over in this podcast in previous segments. We've got ourselves another Harvey Weinstein, another Bill Cosby, another Jeffrey Epstein, another Jerry Sandusky. Sean Combs was hiding in plain sight. And the part of this story that I find most fascinating is not so much what he did with any of the women in his life. The story that I find most fascinating inside this story is what he did as a music producer and a executive, a mogul in the music industry, what was expected of new artists if they wanted to be signed by and promoted by Sean Combs. I've spoken about this frequently on the podcast. There are a number of things that are occurring in our society that we're no longer tolerating as a conscious public. And one of them is the way that the media interacts with corporate power, with political and religious power, and how this information, how the media as this fourth estate, as they like to refer to themselves as, how they're interacting with us. Is it not curious that this is another story of another powerful person that is only being broken after the police have filed charges or executed a search warrant? Does the legacy media even break stories anymore? You have to think that with all of the public appearances that Sean Combs has made over the course of the last 20 years, and how public a figure that he is in the music industry, this is someone that's often seen out at the club. All the rumors that were circulating, and all the rumors that had been substantiated by a number of artists who'd come out and said, there is some weird shit going on in the orbit of Sean Combs. If you were a media outlet, and specific to the Sean Combs case, if you're inside of the music industry, you are losing access to a considerable amount of information, particularly breaking information, if you alienate someone with that kind of public presence. Even artists that were subjected to what we'll call the Sean Combs treatment. And let's be specific about what we're talking about. The Sean Combs treatment, particularly if you're a male, if you wanted to make a record and you wanted Sean Combs to be your producer, to have his studio promote your record, you very likely had to fillet this man in public, very often in a club. you might have to fillet one or many of his quote-unquote crew. I don't have that many social media outlets. I'm not the first to know when it comes to social media. Yet many of the things that I've seen with regard to this aspect of the Sean Combs story is about the homosexuality. And I don't believe that this is about homosexuality at all. It's about power. This is a prison mentality. The way Sean Combs exercised power after he made it, that he quote-unquote made it in the music industry, he exercised power like he was in prison. As much as any of these acts may have been for physical or sexual gratification, they were demeaning and they took power from those that participated. It was a physical manifestation that this person was willing to give away whatever dignity that they had, whatever agency that they had over themselves. They were willing to give that away for an opportunity to make it in the music industry. As the gatekeeper, Sean Combs exercised that power in the most abusive way possible. It's very much like Harvey Weinstein. Harvey Weinstein being the gatekeeper, he's going to either make or break your career in the film industry. As I stated when I spoke to the Harvey Weinstein situation, I don't want to hear the stories of all the artists that feel like that they were degraded by having to participate in any of these acts. I want to hear from the artists who refuse to participate. In other words, the people that are quote-unquote nobodies. People who never made it in the industry because they refused to do the things that were being asked of them. They had too much dignity. They did exercise agency, and they refused to participate, and therefore they were never able to realize their dreams. By the way, it just came over me that I've used in what is now a 5-minute piece the quote-unquote term, I believe 3 times. Greater self-awareness doesn't always mean change. That's pretty good. I'm going to write that down. I might have to do a segment on that. This power dynamic, it is very interesting to me because I do believe it is a prison mentality, and we could easily get into conversations of race, socioeconomic background. The interesting thing to me is I don't believe that what Sean Combs did is any different than what you see in a number of different social paradigms, religious paradigms, political paradigms. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Is what Sean Combs did any different than what Vince McMahon has been accused of? The older I get, I'd like to say the wiser I get, but I'm not going to attribute that to myself. I don't know if it's wisdom or if it's just simple experience. The older I get, the more that I see, the more that I recognize that many of the people that we attribute to being successful have simply been chosen as the winner. If you were tapped by Sean Combs in the hip-hop industry and you were produced by him and you were promoted by him, how much easier is it for you to enjoy success than it is the person that has to go through all of the different obstacles that are placed in front of you in the music industry to try to promote, to produce, to distribute their music? You can't become a famous musician. You can't become a famous Hollywood actor or actress. You can't become a famous wrestler unless you're able to go through the gatekeeper, unless you're able to be tapped by Harvey Weinstein or Vince McMahon, and you're able to get that promotion, that your face is associated with the brand and it's promoted by the brand. As dignified as we want to make it, because we're consumers of these industries, we want to believe that what we're consuming, that there is some higher order, that there is some higher mind, that there is a level of sophistication involved in that artistry. The gross reality is that it operates no different than a prison gang. It is not limited to industry. It is not limited to social order. It's not limited to one's upbringing or socioeconomic background. There's a great scene in Game of Thrones. The character Bronn, who is a sellsword, he's basically a mercenary. He sells his lethal services to the highest bidder. He sums up the reality of what it is to be highborn, to have high status, in a tense conversation with Jaime Lannister.
Icon will never belong to a cutthroat.
No? Who were your ancestors? The ones who made your family rich? Fancy lads in silk? They were fucking cutthroats. That's how all the great houses started, isn't it? With a hard bastard who was good at killing people. Kill a few hundred people, they make you a lord. Kill a few thousand, they make you king. And then, all your cocksucking grandsons can ruin the family with their cocksucking ways.
We want to believe that people who've made it, who've built great fortunes, who are public influencers, that they've done so in the most virtuous, in the most upstanding way. A model of Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, influenced by Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich. As Braun so eloquently explains, very often being king of the mountain is built on the corpses of all of your vanquished foes, of all of the things that you had to do in order to achieve the things that you've achieved. I have no doubt at the beginning of his career that Sean Combs was given nothing. In fact, he faced a great deal of violence, which is very likely why the authorities are investigating the gun charge that he faced years ago, the murder charge that he faced years ago, and the fact that he very likely involved his then-girlfriend Jennifer Lopez in those crimes. Let's not attribute it just to youth. Let's not attribute it just to being wild as a young person. This is the way that many people have to scrap and fight in order to accomplish things, to build the things that they have created over the course of decades. I'm sure you've heard this before, dear listener. Behind every great fortune is a great crime. Because I am the historian that I am, maybe better said, the nerd that I am, yes, we're going to go to the origin of that quote. And it comes from an author, a novelist, a poet, a philosopher, Henri de Balzac. I believe I'm saying that correctly. Yes, the guy's last name is Balzac. In a novel written in 1834, Balzac wrote, "The secret of a great success for which you are at a loss to account is a crime that has never been found out because it was properly executed." Another translation from French to English is, "The secret of a great fortune made without apparent cause is soon forgotten, if the crime is committed in a respectable way." Write it down and commit it to memory, dear listener, because it explains so much about how we're going through a crisis of conscience in the 21st century. We know more now how people actually achieve the great fortunes that they achieved. We know more about who they are as people than we ever did before in the course of human history. And frankly, most of us are disgusted. In that disgust, we may be judgmental. Yet, we really can't put ourselves into the shoes of any of the actors. We can't put ourselves into the shoes of someone like Sean Combs. We've never been through what he went through in order to build his empire. And yet, we've also never been put in the position of being the artists that he's so brazenly taken advantage of. It's very much in the same vein as one Vince McMahon or Harvey Weinstein. At some point, their reputation precedes them, and you have to know what you're getting into if you're going to make it in the industry with them as your benefactor. How badly are you committed to your art as an artist? Are you willing to make a deal with the devil?
Act 2, Oprah is no different than the Liver King. They're all trying to sell you something that they don't do themselves.
I've never really paid much attention to Oprah Winfrey, and why would I? Her shows aren't geared towards me. They're not marketed towards me. Her products aren't marketed towards me. I have begrudging respect for Oprah, for everything that she's built. I know that she's going through a lot in her life. Think about it. Coming up through the daytime television marketplace in the 1980s in Chicago, no doubt the woman faced her fair share of discrimination based on her gender and her race. What she did had an appeal to a certain segment of the population. She did it very well, and she built an empire off of it. How does facing all of that opposition, how does overcoming all of those obstacles influence the development or the regression of your own ego? People come to you and want to give you obscene amounts of money to promote their products. I discussed this in depth with the Dave Ramsey piece that I did, the fact that he was getting a considerable amount of money every month from these industries that allege that they could get you out of your timeshare contracts, and the entire business model is a scam. Because I am old man kicks rocks, I am old man yells at cloud, I'm not as familiar with this business model. It appears that many of these social media influencers have been involved with this non-fungible token, this NFT industry, and most of that is a scam. Influencers are not only paid by these NFTs to promote this product, they're also involved in the creation, the pump and dump scheme, promoting the actual product and then selling it at its peak and watching it all crash. When you have the likes of Matt Damon and Tom Brady, hell, even Larry David pushing some sort of Bitcoin platform that ends up being a complete and total scam, I believe we have to consider how that inflates one's ego to have these obscene amounts of money offered just to have your likeness associated with this product. No one's ever offered me $100,000 or $250,000 or $500,000 to associate my name or likeness with any product. Having said that, I don't have $500,000 or $1 million or $20 million or $100 million already in my bank account. And herein lies the moral question. How would each of us react if we had $20 million and someone came up and offered us $250,000 to promote some kind of product? A product that we didn't understand, that we really weren't associated with. Would we say yes just for the sake of the money? Just for the sake of additional public exposure? I understand this. Speaking it to you in words over this podcast, over this medium, I understand this. And yet, the influence of these people consuming these products has a sub or unconscious influence on me, and I believe it's probably on you, but I'm going to make this particular to me. I cannot help but think that because they have that product in their hand, that they enjoy that product. Because they have that product in their hand, it works for them. The dark reality is that, of course, none of these people really give a damn about any of the products. It's just whether or not the money is right. And in fact, many of these people will subvert whatever purpose that product has with what they prefer, thereby misrepresenting themselves and compromising the faith that we as the consumer have in these people, that we can trust their endorsement. Oprah Winfrey is no different than the Liver King. If you are not familiar, the Liver King is one of these exercise fitness gurus that by his mere appearance, you cannot help but think he's on steroids. This man claimed that he was not on steroids. He claimed that he was able to achieve this physique, this unique physique, simply by eating meat, simply by eating liver. Of course, years later, it's discovered that the guy's on steroids. And he has to do a mea culpa. He has to make the social media rounds. He has to do his apology video. And then to the extent that he can find a safe harbor, he'll go on the podcast here and the podcast there to talk about how he deceived his audience, how he deceived his fan base. Here we have Oprah Winfrey, one of the biggest names in 20th century and 21st century media. She's doing the same exact thing. She promoted Weight Watchers. She had done so for years, and it turns out none of her weight loss or weight stabilization is through Weight Watchers. It's using a pill. She's just like us. She doesn't want to go through all of the pain of getting up an hour, 2 hours early to go to the gym. She doesn't want to watch what she has to eat. She'd rather just take a pill. Western civilization has been down this road before. We had ourselves Fen-Phen in the 80s and the 90s, and now we have Ozempic. We're going to do it all over again. We're going to take a pill, expecting that somehow modern science can achieve for us what we will not do for ourselves, which is change our diet and change our exercise habits. In the commodification of social media, every one of these profiles now that has any kind of following, they're trying to sell you something. My initial impression of this was negativity, of course. That's how most of us look at things, our initial impression of something that we've realized. And that's probably the best way to say it. You know something if you have a discussion with a friend, a family member, you know this thing, and yet in practice, in your day-to-day life, you don't necessarily realize it. And social media has helped me realize that everything is for sale. Every single profile where these people have put all this work in to garner a following, it's all to sell something. It's all in service of making money to sell something to you that very likely the person that has garnered this following is not using, does not subscribe to. And instead of seeing this as a negative, it's just a daily reminder, it's reinforcement that you can't trust outside sources. The people who have these great physiques, you don't know what they're doing in order to achieve those physiques. The people who present like they have great health, you don't know that they're in great health. The people that present that they have great mental health, you don't know that they are mentally healthy. So instead of condemning Oprah, I want to thank her. I want to thank her for another reminder that everything that I see on social media, that everything I see in the legacy media, it's all pretty much bullshit. In order to achieve the things that we want out of life, we have to make choices every single day. And some of the most minute, mundane choices that we make can have an outsized influence on what type of results we achieve months, if not years down the road. And that doesn't sell. Or to the extent that it does sell, that you could even make a program out of it, it certainly is not going to be as popular. Life isn't a series of steps. It's a series of baby steps. It's about staying present in the moment, on your path, on your journey, and continuing to work. It's that old Chinese proverb, dripping water can eat through a stone. We know that to be true. We also know that that takes a hell of a long time, and it's tedious and boring. I understand that tedium. I've been writing this podcast, recording this podcast, editing this podcast, producing this podcast for 4 years, and I've probably increased my weekly listeners from 25 to 100. That's 4 times the amount of listeners that I had when I first started. Yet you don't feel like you're making any progress. That's where we are all vulnerable. That's where we feel like we want to make a leap instead of a tiny baby step. And that's where all of these influencers, all of these people in the media, they can take advantage of us. We want to achieve the same kind of success that they did, not recognizing that they had to take all of those baby steps and go through the tedium and the boring work on a day-to-day basis in order to achieve the heights that they have. And after having achieved those heights, what do? Like the rest of us, they're exhausted. They just want to take a pill. I'm not going to condemn that in me. I won't condemn it in them. But I'm sure as hell not going to buy it anymore.
Act 3. The Sage Steele revelation was not a revelation.
Sage Steele was one of the Sports Center broadcasters on ESPN. She did talking head stuff. She recently left ESPN and cited her inability to speak freely, the lack of freedom of speech within the organization, what have you. She was recently on Bill Maher's podcast, and she told this story that's now making the rounds about her time at ESPN in an interview that she did with President Biden in 2021. The interview centered around COVID and how all of the leagues were handling COVID and slowly starting to ramp up their schedules and then letting, gradually mind you, the fans back into the stadiums. The first part of the story that Sage retells is the fact that all of the questions that she was to ask President Biden were scripted. The second part of the story was the fact that because the broadcast was being done via satellite and there were technical issues that needed to be resolved, she had some back and forth banter with President Biden, and he presented as forgetful, dawdling, not in control of his full capacities. I just want to very quickly comment on this story, being that it's not a story. I want to very quickly comment on these revelations, being that they're not revelations. If you know anything about presidential politics, and you know anything about presidents having interviews with any media outlet or organization outside of the political sphere, so we're not talking about CBS News or the New York Times, we're talking about ESPN. This is a softball interview. Every president does these types of interviews, and every presidential staff has the same types of requirements. They're going to vet all the questions that are asked. It's not going to be a back and forth. They're going to want to know exactly how these interviews are going to transpire, and it's generally going to be short. It's a fluff interview. George W. Bush and the Bush administration, notorious for wanting to control all of the variables concerning these types of interviews. And more than that, the Trump administration and the Trump staff, to the extent that they could, wanted to control every piece of the environment for any interview that President Trump did. It is not a unique circumstance. It certainly isn't uncommon. What you don't hear very frequently in any of these discussions about Sage Steele's, again, revelation, which I don't believe it is, why did she agree? It just illustrates to me, dear listener, she's a broadcaster on a sports network. She's a pretty face that will write out a script and read it from a teleprompter, very often influenced by an editor or producer. And if she doesn't show any strength in that realm and being able to actually write out her own script, somebody's going to write it for her and she'll just read it off a teleprompter. Of course, a presidential staff is going to want to limit the type of questions, want to limit the interaction that a president has with this type of talking head. The issue is, does that person agree? A journalist would not. That's why fewer and fewer presidential administrations are going to have these types of interviews with journalists. That it's being used to make the political rounds right now, that's more a testament to the partisanship that we all suffer from than it is this is a revelation about how presidential interviews operate. This type of revelation, if you can even call it that, is akin to discovering that these people who are called on in these presidential question and answer sessions leading up to a presidential election, that they're all staged and scripted, that all the questions haven't been vetted already, that all of the people haven't been vetted already. Do any of you honestly believe that you could go and sit in on one of these question and answer sessions with a president of the United States or with a candidate to be president of the United States and just randomly stand up and ask any question that you wanted? It's all staged. And this is a great piece to do after the piece that I did about Oprah Winfrey and the fact that she was taking a diet pill in order to maintain her weight and not following along with one of her biggest sponsors, Weight Watchers, that all of the things that she had told her faithful audience about her faithfulness to that product was bullshit. It's all staged. It's all a dog and pony show. And we can look at that from a negative standpoint. We can try to condemn, and particularly the people who are involved, demean them, or we can change our habits. We can change our consumption habits, and we can change our voting habits. If you, as a purported member of the media, believe that you are going to be able to ask the President of the United States questions randomly or have a back and forth where you're able to challenge them on a sports program, that speaks more to who you are as a self-proclaimed journalist than it does about the process or the political administration for that president. And what it says is not complimentary.
Act 4, 5 minutes on the Tennessee Vols and the loss to Purdue.
Zach Edey committed a number of fouls on offense and defense that were not called. Okay, we got that out of the way. That is not the reason why Tennessee lost in the Elite Eight to Purdue. The Vols had a great season. I'm going to start the piece by commenting on how well Dalton Knecht came into the program and played over the course of this one season, this one-and-done season for him. Tennessee basketball was the regular season champion for the SEC. This is the second year in a row that they did it. Unfortunately, it was also the second year in a row that they lost in the first round of the SEC tournament. Although Tennessee had a number of players on the team that were over 7 feet tall, the Achilles heel of this team was the fact that they did not have any consistent offensive performance from any one of their bigs at center throughout the course of the season. If you don't have a center that can play on offense and threaten the center for the other team or threaten any of their larger power forwards, you don't have someone that can get those people into foul trouble. You don't have someone that the ball can go to in the middle of the floor and you can do a lot of different things going inside out. You don't have someone that you can run the pick and roll with. I'm not going to speak but so critically about any one of the players on the Tennessee basketball team. They're kids. The older I get, the further away I am from that old me that could scream at the television, not just because of the outcome of some sporting event, but because of the people who are involved. Many of them are just kids. Granted, they're kids who were put into the spotlight for their whole lives. They've been pampered. Many of them are getting paid millions of dollars, but they're still kids. Tennessee has a center. He's over 7 feet tall. His name is Jonas Aidoo. He is a transfer from Marquette. He often makes catching the basketball look like one of the hardest things that one can do in the game of basketball. If we were playing Dungeons and Dragons and Jonas Aidoo was a character, his dexterity would be 0. Does not have, in the parlance of college and pro basketball, soft hands, and does not have good footwork either. Throughout the course of the season, one of the big problems that Tennessee had was being able to put pressure on another team in the post via a big man that can post up next to the basket and can score a consistent, easy basket. When simply catching the basketball in the post becomes an ordeal for a big man, you've got problems. And that's exactly what happened in Tennessee's matchup with Purdue. Not only could Zach Edey get into the post and score easily, no one on Tennessee's team could threaten him on the other side of the floor, get him into foul trouble, and get his bottom on the bench for any period of time. Tennessee did try to get the ball into the post, to put Edey in some disadvantages, to make it harder for Edey to be aggressive, and Aidoo, our center, Tennessee center, could not catch the basketball. And if he did catch the basketball, because his footwork was so bad, he couldn't get any closer to the basket than he did from the place where he caught the basketball. My impression of the way this game progressed was that the referees noted the fact that Tennessee didn't have anybody in the offensive post position that could do anything with Edey, and the longer that game went on, they gave more and more liberties to Edey. An analogy would be a baseball pitcher that either A, can't miss the strike zone, or B, can't hit the strike zone. Eventually, the umpires start to allow that to color the way that they see the next pitch. If a pitcher is on, then the next pitch, if it is close to being a strike, it gets called a strike. And vice versa. If a pitcher can't hit the strike zone to save their life, and it's on the edge of the strike zone, very likely that pitch is going to be called a ball. It wasn't until Tennessee put in a third-string center, Australia, that they enjoyed any kind of success when it came to dealing with Zach Edey, and the game started being officiated a little bit more fairly. That was late in the second half, and by then, Edey had established himself. The referees had allowed Edey to establish himself in the way that he was playing, and that wasn't going to change. The rest of the teams left in the Final Four all have players that can threaten Edey on the offensive end under the basket. They all have power forwards and centers that can actually adeptly catch the ball next to the basket and score it. Tennessee could not do that, and thus did not deserve to win that game. Cheated, they were not. This is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast.